How can we think theologically? What are the main components of church, and kind of distill and take out what's tradition and really what's the essence of church that could be done in different ways and is still church, but make it relevant to different contexts.
Welcome to Advent Next, a place where we hold life and faith discussions with experts and Ph.D. professors about theology, history, culture, and faith. So, what is church? Is it the building, the traditions and liturgy? Is it the people? Or is it the theology that binds the people and community together? It's often discussed, and we hear it all the time, that young people continue to leave the church. But in order to answer the question of why, I think it's important that we have a grasp upon what is church, and whether or not we've been placing emphasis upon traditions or other things rather than the essentials of what would make a church relevant and adaptable to different contexts and to different generations. So in the exploration of the question of what is church and how we can distill the most essential elements of church to make it adaptable to our context, we've invited Dr. Gerardo Oudri to share his thoughts. He's a pastor, he has his DMin from Fuller, and right now he's currently working on his Ph.D. in Ecclesiology from Andrews. Thank you so much, Gerardo Oudri. Is that how you say your last name? Okay. Just wanted to...
Oudri. Okay. Oudri in Spanish, so you can choose. Pick and choose.
The rolling R is hard for me.
I know, for everybody. Most people, yeah.
Thanks so much for being on the show today. We appreciate you having you on.
Wait, don't you speak Spanish?
I do, but the R's are hard for me. They are. They just are.
Okay.
It's a different.
Interesting.
Different. Max is back on today.
I'm back.
Max.
I'm here.
And go ahead.
Oh, I know. The thing that everyone is probably wondering, and hopefully you can shed some light on this, is does doing this show make me and Kendra televangelists?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Cool.
Big time.
Does that mean I can start asking them for money?
For big donations.
Yeah.
As long as you make an appeal at the end.
Okay.
To your personal Cash App.
Yeah. I wish I had Cash App.
So thanks again for being on today. So today we're talking about something that, kind of a big word, ecclesiology. One, I'm going to have you introduce yourself, but then I want you to talk about, like, if we could break that big word into something a little smaller, what that would be. So first, tell us a little bit about yourself.
All right. Well, what would you like to know? I could spend 2 hours sharing my story.
How do you get your hair so nice?
I'm telling you. I know you're jealous, but that's a different story. I grew up in Uruguay, South America, and grew up in the church. My parents were not Seventh-day Adventists at first. Then they got married. Then it's an interesting story how they get to know the Adventist church. But I grew up in the church and studied theology in Argentina. Then went to Andrews University in Michigan to do my MDiv. Again, that's a long story how God made that happen, and it was not my plan, but anyhow. And then got married to my wife, Paula. Now we have 2 teenage daughters. And we served. I'm a pastor, so we worked in northern Argentina for almost 3 years. And my wife was born in Argentina, but her family moved to Canada, to Ontario, when she was 5 months old. Gotcha. So she's, I guess, more Canadian than anything else. And so we were in Argentina for about 3 years, and I received a call to serve as a pastor in Ontario, Canada. Spent about 14 years serving there. That's where I met Max. We have a past.
There's a lot of stories.
Some history back there.
There's a ukulele band.
I'm telling you. I should have brought mine, but
there was a lot.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So, and then about 2.5 years ago, we moved to Berrien Springs, Michigan, and I'm doing a PhD again at Andrews University.
And you have your DMin from Fuller as well, right?
That's right. God opened a door there. I was pastoring at the time in Ontario, and it was an amazing experience. Did a DMin, doctor in ministry, in Pasadena, and so.
How did you like the DMin program in Pasadena? Because I contemplated going there to Fuller, and I love connecting with different denominations, and it seems like a really good program. What were some things that you enjoyed from that?
At the time when I started to think about that, doing a DMin, and how it happened, where I was in Ontario, the conference kind of opened the doors, and at a workers' meeting where all the pastors from the conference were there, and they were planning to be supportive of those who wanted to study, as long as they had the funds. And I don't think many at the time realized what they were saying. Many of the pastors, they were just probably talking to each other, but I understood. So I went and talked to them. And because I had done my MDiv, Masters of Divinity at Andrews, I thought it would be great to have another experiences. And Fuller is well known for its DMin program worldwide, one of the largest, if not the largest. So I had some friends that were there, and so I chose to do it there. And it was a phenomenal experience. I think that as much as possible, we need to interact with Christians of other denominations.
Yes.
We can learn from each other. One of the things and this is perhaps a very simple thing to say, but we would spend a week or two together, and it was a cohort intensive classes. So we would do lunch together with all the other students, and then to share our stories and realize that we face the same challenges. Our challenges in the Adventist faith are not unique, whether it be being relevant to youth, young adults, whether it be issues with leadership in the church or members or struggles of different nature. And it was great to have fellowship and to see that there is great women and men of God in all faiths.
Brothers and sisters, here we are.
Even I had opportunities to share, things that are unique to Adventism, in a very mature context where it's not so much about I'm trying to convince you that, we're better because of ABC, but just, having these conversations. They would ask things about the Sabbath, about health, and it was great. It was a great experience.
I'm such an advocate for that, because there has to be this kind of commingling of ideas, because I feel like other churches tend to stay centered on Christ a little better, and we as Adventists, we tend to get lost in the weeds of like prophecy or health message or things that are, supposed to be the garnish become the main dish, and Jesus, who's the main dish, becomes the garnish.
I agree. You're right. Yeah. And in Argentina, when we served there for about 3 years, I reached out to the ministerial group there in a small town. And I remember there was this Lutheran pastor who he was not at first, not very open to me, an Adventist pastor, being part of that group. And then I realized why. He had been somewhere else before. And I think a colleague of ours, God bless his heart, I'm sure he was sincere, but he was not the best at interacting with colleagues from other faiths. So when I went to the first meeting, it was like, wow. Why is this guy here? And it's like, well, you're my brothers and sisters, and I'd like to be part of this conversation. Yeah. And over time, I saw a change in him. So I think we need to do that.
So when did you both become Jesuit infiltrators? I know that our comment section on YouTube is probably really concerned.
Yes. Well, this is not confession time, okay?
Back in 1990. Oh, wow.
I was 3.
Yeah.
I was being born. Yeah. I feel an affinity, obviously. I mean, we know each other's background, but I did my undergraduate work at Tyndale, multi-denominational school, and I found that really enriching, and not what I went into that experience, and this I think speaks to the background of where I was coming from in Adventism at the time. Yeah. But I went into that experience just being like, there's going to be a lot of people here at this school who need to be called out of Babylon, out of Babylon, and I came out of that experience just being like, well, the world is so much bigger than my tiny little corner of it that I've occupied, and there are people who have vastly different and yet oddly comparable, similar experiences to me, and I'm all the wealthier for it in a personal sense, in a character sense and an intellectual sense for that. And I think that it's the kind of experience that maybe rubs people the wrong way in our church.
Yeah.
I think it's worth discussing why that is. I don't know if that's the first thing we'll get to or not, but I think it's something that is going to come up over and over again, is that it's not a normal experience for Adventists to have.
Yeah. And something that I experienced, I remember the first paper I wrote at Fuller, and they have these 3 components for your research and ministry. It's a practical degree. So one is, of course, the Bible. Yeah. Then your context. You need to learn to analyze your context. And the third one is your faith tradition. So you're part of a tradition. So you need to see what the conversation is now, what it has been in the past. And I remember the first paper, I was kind of hesitant a little bit. Not that I'm ashamed of our tradition or, the Spirit of Prophecy, Ellen White, but I was like, I know that this is not an Adventist school, so I don't want to make that the main voice. And I remember the feedback from the professor was like, this is a great paper, but, we want to hear more from your faith tradition.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, okay. Yeah. That's fine. I can do that. And then the next one, I was more like, okay, Ellen White and all of that. And it was celebrated. Yeah, that's precisely what we want to see.
Wow.
Because you're not here to convince us of things. You are, doing research and planning for your context and your church. And that's part of a bigger picture. And you need to not only be aware, but speak within those
context.
In that context.
Wow.
And so I think it's great. Also, the idea, which I don't think many people have that notion that, if you dialogue with people from other faiths, you may be persuaded to go astray or, change your theology. Nowadays, with the information, all over online and whatnot, if that's going to happen, you don't need, it's going to happen regardless of,
We should be persuaded out of a few things that from these traditions. Because, I think it just goes to show even this professor how mature he was in kind of just being open-minded, and not wanting to relegate you to something that is like cultish or like not putting labels, just being like, hey, like this is your tradition, like let's celebrate it. Let's really kind of prepare you for this context. And if we could have that same breadth of elasticity and understanding, I think we could gain a lot from learning from other, denominations as far as grace or really standing on the pillar of who Jesus is.
Of Jesus,
yeah, exactly.
Now, just to be extremely clear, I think that, for example, Andrews University is a great place. Yes. So I'm not saying, Fuller, now Andrews. No, I think it's a great place. Yeah. And I'm now studying at Andrews and doing a Ph.D.
Right.
And so at the time, it had nothing to do with like, Andrews, I don't want to go. No, it was more like, you pray and you think and you talk to people. Right. And I felt at the time that was the place to go for that program. Right. And it was a great thing.
Yeah.
So,
but I love Andrews too.
So, if someone is, some of our listeners are thinking where to go, please do consider Andrews too. It's a great, great program.
Yeah. No, that's true. That's true. So how did you get started into the ecclesiology? Because right now you're here and you're studying your Ph.D. in ecclesiology. So what is ecclesiology and how did you get interested in this aspect?
Well, to put it in a very short and simple, perhaps definition, ecclesiology is the study of the church, the doctrine of the church. The word comes from the Greek, ecclesia, 2 words, ecclesia and logia. Ecclesia is the church gathering, assembly. It came from a secular, usage of the term, and then the church, the early church, borrowed that as it borrowed many other things.
How dare they?
Can you imagine that? As they borrowed many other things, and we may talk about that later on.
Okay.
But from their cultural context. So that is, again, ecclesiology is the study of the church, the doctrine of the church. And I got into it, I guess, 3 main reasons. I was thinking about that. And number one, and there is no particular order, but one is as a pastor, working as a pastor. At some point, you need to ask yourself, why are we doing what we're doing? You inherit, a set of practices, traditions, and okay, you get into the motions, and okay, we have, in our case, in the Adventist tradition, Sabbath, on Saturday, you go to church, you have Sabbath school, then you have the main service, you may have, activities in the afternoon, AY, and this and that, but then you need to ask, why are we doing all of this?
Yeah.
Why do we have church? So I always had this question, and in fact, when I was doing the MDiv at Andrews, I spent a summer back home in Uruguay helping the youth director at the conference back home. And one weekend we went with a group of young people camping, and it was a long weekend. So on Thursday, some of us went to the central church in the capital city in Uruguay, to just sleep there a few hours. Then a bus was going to come and pick us up early in the morning. And so you can imagine the basement of the church, some people playing board games and others just talking, singing with a guitar. It was great. And I was sitting next to, at one point, to two of those youth, and I overheard the conversation. Somebody was saying, like, hey, for example, hey, haven't seen Max at church, for the last month. Oh, yeah, I wonder what's happening with his spiritual life. Like something is wrong. And the other person is like, well, why are you saying that? I mean, that the fact that he's not going to church or lately doesn't mean. So then the question arose, do you need to go to church to be spiritually healthy? And we had a great conversation, but to be honest with you, the answers did not really, satisfy me inside. And I kind of carry those questions
or
with me.
Some of the answers that they...
Well, like, you find support. If we work together for mission, we're more effective when we're together. But then you could, counteract those. So like, yeah, but, if God wants to use you alone and through the Holy Spirit.
Like John the Baptist or something.
Right. I mean, you don't need 10 other people. You can be very effective. And, for spiritual growth, if God is with me and my family and I'm living in a mountain, we can be very healthy. And so why do, so that's one of the reasons that I always was like, why do we need the church? The other thing, a second reason is, while I was doing research for my project at Fuller, I had to write a chapter on ecclesiology, right? Because the final goal of the project is to do something practical, to implement something in your context. But you also have to do research. What is the church and kind of your view of the church, which I think should inform everything we do in church.
Right.
And doing that research, I came to the conclusion at the time that we didn't have much in Adventism in terms of ecclesiology. We have some notions. We tend to, the moment we think church, we gravitate to the remnant, the idea of that group of people.
The last church.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oops. And then I found like maybe 4 or 5 books. I mean, you can go to our bookstores like the ABC, and if you look for books on the Sabbath, you'll find tens. Second Coming, many, and that's great, right? Yeah. Sanctuary, same thing. But when it comes to the church, you don't find many.
And when you say that, you mean like the church in a broad sense, like the whole idea of the church, or like church, like not... Here's a book about the remnant, or like ecclesiology as a whole.
Exactly. Ecclesiology, the idea of the church in general.
Right.
And I think you're right. You will probably find several books on the remnant, again, because that's church for us. We tend to think remnant.
Right.
And I think it's good. Remnant is part of that. But in my humble opinion, and I should, by the way, say this at this very point, I do not consider myself an expert. I'm at the very beginning of, my journey into hopefully going deeper in ecclesiology. I do have some ideas, and I'm happy to share those. But so, and I remember going to Andrews, meeting with some professors that I knew from before, and sharing my burden, saying, I'm thinking of doing a PhD. Oh, okay, so what area? Ecclesiology, great. And I said, I feel that there is so much to be done. Yeah, absolutely. And I remember one professor in particular, me saying, the more I try to find stuff, I only, see these books, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, something like that. And I would say, yeah, that's precisely what we have here. They all confirmed.
Yeah.
So that was the second point, doing research. The second reason, okay, I feel I want to go deeper in that.
So
the third one, go ahead.
So just to kind of clarify too, so when we're talking about ecclesiology, are we just talking about how we do church as far as liturgy, or what defines the church as far as the doctrine and what holds people together?
Thank you for that question. Yeah. And perhaps later on, I'd like to mention something about where we tend to go. We tend to be very functional when we think church. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's more than just how to do things or worship services, is the doctrine, the theology behind the church. What does the Bible say about church? Why church? What is really the church? But just to finish, the third reason, which for me is very important for me personally, working with young people, both at the local church, local church level, and then I served as youth director at the conference level in Ontario, and that's where we connected with Max, and we had a great time. I was blessed by his ministry.
Oh, thanks.
Social media.
And I by yours.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm going to get emotional now.
We can cry.
We can cry. But working with young people, I think, I would say all over the world, but in some contexts even more so, like North America, Europe, we have some serious issues, right? Many youth, young adults leaving the church.
Right.
By that I mean the church as the institution, because we can talk church from different angles, right?
Right.
But to me, to be honest with you, this is church. If we are gathered around the person of Jesus, it's church, right? Yeah. But we think of church as the institution, as the building that we go to,
and the event on Saturday.
The event, exactly. So, but the question begs to be, asked, what's next? And to me, we tend to sometimes, I'm just trying to promote Advent next, right? Absolutely. Thank you, Max.
You're welcome. I'm so smart.
For me, I was trying to do it kind of in a subliminal way, but okay, we'll just point to the sign in front of me. Exactly. But seriously, when you think, okay, if we want to be relevant to the next generation and the following generations, sometimes we do things from a very pragmatic, perspective, which is not altogether wrong, but I feel we also need to think theologically. And I don't want to go too much because that's another passion of mine. I think that we need to do serious theological thinking at all levels of the church, not just, in the academic circles.
Yes,
and then
absolutely.
That becomes in my, the way I see things, kind of the madhouse where we have relatives there, let's go and visit them every once in a while and see the crazy ideas they have. Okay. Right, bye. And then we go to, this is real life, so this is what we do. No. We need to bring serious theological thinking in everything we do. Thinking youth, young adults, how can we think theologically? What are the main components of church? And kind of distill and take out what's tradition and really what's the essence of church that could be, done in different ways, and it's still church, but make it relevant to different contexts.
And I think it's so important, that you're bringing this up, because we do theology all the time. I mean, philosophy, study of God or just the study of how life works is being bombarded upon us all the time, whether it's books or television shows. Like, as a writer, I'm seeing, the story that people are trying to bring across, and we can define, what types of worldviews are they promoting. Like, I just been reading this book I'm sure you've all heard of it, but I won't say the entire title, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a
Oh, yeah.
But that, I've been reading this book, and an underlying premise is Buddhism, about how to just kind of let go and not care. But he has a lot of other good stuff about, because Buddhism is more like the absence of suffering, and this book is more like how to choose your sufferings. But there's a core theology behind this. Mm-hmm. And so how do we see this in all of our life? And if we're not training the lay people to think theologically about the information that they're receiving, then they're just going to be kind of swept away and think everything is cool. Yeah.
Yeah, there is you may have heard this phrase, lex orandi, lex credendi, kind of principle which means? Meaning the way you pray or the way you do things, eventually your practices become your theology inadvertently. So because we do things in this way for so long, then and let me give you one very simple example. In our Adventist context, when we do communion, all right, we have usually one part of the communion service is the deaconesses come, and there is a tablecloth that covers, the emblems and everything, and they take it and they fold it in a very nice and kind of ritualistic way, which is, again, there's nothing wrong theologically. But I can tell you, and maybe I'm wrong, and hopefully I'm wrong, that in many churches, if I were to come as a pastor and say, for the next communion, we're not going to do that part, many people will go like, what? What do you mean? This is the way we do it, right? But when you think, okay, where do you find that in Scripture? That's just a practice that we inherited,
right? Even Jesus explicitly did not do that.
Exactly.
There's hey guys, we gotta have dinner, but before we do, let's take this. Please, what?
Peter and James, get up.
Please unfold the food blanket.
Yeah.
And so. And that's a very, very simple, and maybe it won't happen, but I can tell you that in some contexts, I know it will be an issue. Okay, you have to explain, and sometimes you go, you know what? Okay, let's do it anyhow. That's, let's do it. So I remember when I was studying at Fuller, I read a book that really impacted me. There are some books that you read and it's like, wow, this is and that's The Forgotten Ways by Alan Hirsch. And I would really, suggest or recommend that book to everybody that wants to think about church. And in one section of the book, he talks about Constantine and the changes that took place in the church because of him. And for us, of course, Constantine is a well-known figure, right? Because of the Sabbath, the change of the Sabbath. And Hirsch actually mentions that in the list of things that changed. But there are many other things that changed because of him in terms of the way we do church. And I would say that since then, we have been doing church in a very Constantinian way, even in the Adventist church, because we inherited those things.
Right.
And I'm not saying, again, that this is all wrong, but I think that we need to question the things the way we do them, right?
That's how we got started. We started questioning the Bible and the theology behind it, and then we came to different conclusions.
Exactly. And so, for example, some of the things, and we could talk for a long time about that. To me, it's fascinating, but before Constantine, the church was a movement, mostly persecuted, meeting in homes, using even the cultural way of that households were organized in the Greco-Roman culture. That's why you have the titles for the position, leadership positions in the church, of deacons and whatnot. Those were terms that were used in that system, in other words,
household,
system.
Yeah.
So to the point where some scholars suggest that some scholars say, well, the Christian church, the early Christian church, borrowed from the synagogue, right, the way to do things. But others have said, well, maybe not so much. When you think of the leadership positions, they didn't take that from the synagogue model.
Right.
Right. So. Before Constantine, it was more of a movement, meeting in homes. It was incarnational, a word that has been used in the last few years, missional, going to where the people were and whatnot. now the emperor becomes a Christian, and that's questionable.
Right.
I don't like to judge Constantine. Who am I to judge him? But, it's hard to believe that at least, if not him, but all the multitudes that all of a sudden now become Christian, probably there was, many were not truly converted.
Right.
Many practices were brought from other, pagan religions. But now, of course, big buildings begin to be built. Mm-hmm. People come in masses to these buildings. Now, more and more, you have a group of professionals in charge of everything up front. So it goes from being a movement, being in homes, now in these big buildings where only a minority lead out. And more the centrality is on the leadership. The bishop becomes central. Yeah. And then slowly, we move into a sacramental view of the church, where you need the church to be saved because the sacraments, are valid and efficacious, done by the bishop or the leaders. So, and if it's done, as long as you go through the motions, that's it. Yeah. But now, when you think of how we do even evangelism in our system, in our church, usually, even if we rent a place, a location, or if we do it in the church, we have people come to us and sit in rows and listen to somebody up front. It's very Constantinian in many ways. So, again, I want to say I'm not completely opposed to all of that, but I'm saying we need to question the why we do
what we
things
do.
Exactly.
I'm glad you used the word slowly, because I think a lot of people, when we get to Constantine, we think of it as like this overnight shift where he showed up and boom, and everything was unrecognizable, and Nicaea happens in 325, and for the next few decades, like the state of Christianity in that empire, especially after Constantine's death, it's like constantly switching hands. Yeah. And the official version goes from like a Trinitarian to an Arian version and back and forth all over the place until like 381 or I'm a huge nerd for this time in history. Yeah. But it's definitely, you see kind of this seismic shift in the culture of the church to the point that like you had new bishops being installed, like the emperor's like chariots are rolling up to the local house church and just like, oh, this is your old pastor. Now this guy is like, oh great, this is the Jesus way of doing things. Totally. It's definitely kind of this cataclysmic moment in Christian history. And
even like going back to what I was sharing about the household model, right, of church. And it has been proven and archaeologically that it was very common in that context for the woman of the house to be in charge of the household. And the man would go to the square, so to speak, and deal with the businesses. And so that's why we see more than once in the New Testament, Paul saying to the church that meets in the house of, and it's a woman, and chances are that person was kind of the matron of the house, the in charge, and a major figure, of authority in that context. And also for me, and I don't know, again, I don't have DVDs from the time and how the church functioned, but if we're meeting in a home, many of the questions on authority and leadership and position really take a whole different perspective.
Right.
If we're meeting like this, right? And you start sharing, as a woman, and then maybe a young person shares, is not the same as, now that person is going up front, a position of something is different. It's more flat.
You're literally on an actual physical pedestal. Like, exactly. What's the platform, right?
Exactly.
And it takes away from this communal engagement that comes with being like, we're around a table, literally sharing in a supper together and praying and talking together. Exactly.
And so that book for me by Alan Hirsch was very helpful in thinking, okay, wow, maybe there's so many. And so how can we, if we could literally put, the church in a pot and boil it so that we can get the essence, get rid of whatever is superficial of all the practices.
Right.
And maybe by the third or fourth time, I don't want to sound too repetitive. It's not that I'm opposed to traditions that we have in themselves. They're not bad in themselves. I just want to make sure that we, make a distinction on what is really the church.
Right. Because so many people,
the essence of the church, and it could take that form. And if it's effective in that way in some context, by all means, let's do it. Big, massive buildings. And if that's really making disciples, let's do that. But if we need something different, as long as we find these core essential ingredients of what, is part of the church, by all means. And this is church for me.
Yeah, no, it's true, because I think, as you mentioned, so many youth and young people are leaving the church because they find so much liturgy in the church. And they're like, this isn't really significant. Like, we're going through all of these motions, but there's no meaning to it. And so it becomes, the sermon becomes a very small slice of what church is. And then it's like, why do I need to give it my entire, morning to have just a brief moment of the word, sometimes maybe not that good, and then to go back home. Mm-hmm. I've been contemplating the fact that the church is no longer the central point of information. Back in the Middle Ages, we go to church because we can't read scripture because we're illiterate, or it's in Latin, or it's in some other language we don't understand. And this is where we get the information of scripture. Mm-hmm. But now we live in a very educated society that can read, can write, and can get the internet and watch as many sermons as you want. And the church is no longer the central location for information. Mm-hmm. And so how do we make it a place of community? And I think, we see people moving to the sticky church model, or like just the small group model, where you're binding a larger church together by breaking it up into small groups and allowing that kind of fellowship to take place. Mm-hmm. So
I think that, some of the, it's impossible to really, describe all the transformations of ecclesiology over history. That would take a long time. Yeah. But a few things that I think are important to mention, because we are heirs of the Reformation, right? So the Reformers came and, in their fight against some of the wrong things that were taking place, all right, at the time, the abuses that even nowadays, Catholics agree that there were many abuses and things that were happening. They came up with two marks of the church, Luther and Calvin, right? Before, the church is very sacrament-oriented. Now they are like wherever the word of God is preached, and the sacraments are,
secondary.
Oh no, the sacraments are carried out properly. Yeah. That's where the church is. Mm. Yeah. And so two things that I see, and that's my observation. First is the focus now more on preaching on the right message, right? Following the text the best way possible, and really the right preaching, which I think it's very important. Yeah. And then kind of this functional, thing that if things are done properly, and the message is the right message, that's where the church is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that even though those things are important, there is more to it. And as Adventists, we have been extremely, this is again my opinion, I may be wrong, very functional when it comes to thinking the church. Barry Oliver wrote a dissertation in the 80s, he's an Adventist, on the structural or organizational changes that took place at the end of the 19th century and then the beginning of the 20th century in the Adventist church. Right? And so, again, to put it in a very concise way, there were two groups, as usual, right? You have two groups, whether you call them liberal and conservatives or whatnot. But one group was kind of pushing for a more functional way of thinking church. Christ is coming soon. We need to get organized to get the job done so that we can go home.
Right.
And I would say in many ways, amen to that. We need to do what we need to do and preach and share. And yes, we want Christ to come soon. Absolutely. There was another group, led by, so this group was led by Daniels and others. This other group was led by Wagner, Jones, and they were thinking more church in terms of ontology and ontological thinking. What is really the essence of church? Yeah, the functionality and all that. That's and then back and forth. And this group on functionality, the functional view, won. And since then, since that time, 1903, 1913, until the 80s, I would say, and again, wrote a paper on that, not an expert yet, but I would say for what I saw, I found, we didn't even talk church as in doing theological thinking on church. And it's interesting because the 20th century was huge on ecclesiology in other circles. But for us, we were like, hey, we decided that. We are organized now the right way. Let's preach and do the right thing. So very functional way of viewing the church. And it was not until, I would say, the late 1980s and then the 90s and on that we started thinking church again. But again, that's where I said before, we have only a few books, and some are the result of an event, say like a symposium, where you have a collage of papers, but it's not, always. It's good. It's different views and notions. So, but I think that we need both. We need not just the functional, but also the more ontological, the essence of what means to be the church. Yeah.
Wow. Thanks for listening as we break the ice for next week's discussion on adopting a more precise or maybe even broader view of what is church. This week we laid some foundation, but we're excited to discuss more about the concept of the mission of the church, which some would say is to restore the image of God, and how that's not always measured in the number of converts. Once again, we're delighted that you joined us today. Whatever platform you're listening on, be sure to comment, like, and subscribe. See you next week.